And in theory, we are live on the interwebs.
Looks like it.
All right. Good deal. Well, hello there, sword friends. Today I have Samurai James with me. Special thanks to him for taking time to tell me all the things I've done dumbly about armor and educate us all more about it. Links to his channel and all that kind of stuff are in the description. If you are so inclined, please check it out. Without further ado, though, I will ask Samurai James to introduce himself for those of you that are not familiar.
Sorry, can you say that again? My phone was just picking up the live stream. I was trying to watch for chat.
No problem. Introduce yourself.
Oh, so konnichiwa, Samurai James. Thanks for having me on. I've been doing YouTube for a handful of years and swords and armor for about 30 years for swords and armor for about 20, 25, somewhere thereabouts, more often the more recent years. Just been a big fan of it for a long time. Started off with cartoons and movies like a lot of people did. I'm a 90s kid, so there was no shortage of, ninja movies, samurai movies, stuff about knights and everything. So got my start in that and just kind of never grew out of it.
Well, welcome. And your nerdery is welcome. I, too, remember the movies. Did you watch movies that definitely were not appropriate for you as a kid?
I mean, the 90s was like a different time. So, you came home from school, you locked the door behind you and everything. It was the whole like latchkey kid. So in modern context, yeah, there was like blood and people like losing limbs and stuff when I was 12. But, it's not anything that gave me nightmares or therapy or anything. You wouldn't get away with it today, but it didn't seem that weird to me.
It's like we're both like, I don't think it had any lasting scars as we sit behind like a wall of swords.
Not at all.
It had an impact, but I don't think it was a negative one,
Yeah.
Yeah, it dawns on me that like I remember watching Revenge of the Ninja and like a whole bunch of like kung fu and ninja style movies when I was a kid and horror movies. But I think I was like 5.
Gosh.
Yeah. Rated R just meant like recommended for children. But yeah. That also seemed to be like a thing. To be like Revenge of the Ninja, and like other people I knew watched it and they were also 5. So yeah. Anyway, Alex says RoboCop, one of his favorite movies. Yeah, I remember RoboCop very early as well.
Oh yeah, that one was pretty gruesome too. Seeing him get shot up.
Yeah, seeing him get shot up and then like oddly like getting hacked up and cyberpunk necromancy is like the positive spin on the movie. Anyway, armor. Before we go into random cultural references, which I'm happy to talk about, it dawns on me that might be a more interesting topic, honestly, to some folks. But armor. Samurai James has a lot of background in armor and makes a lot of video content about it and has just a dearth of experience when it comes to armor. And so hopefully having seen some of the content that I produced about the armor set that I got, I'd love to know what you think I missed or, well, really kind of where the gaps are.
I think you did a great job with covering it. You had a pretty good amount of time in the suit before you went up to do the review. You didn't just like get it, unbox it and be like, oh, this is the greatest thing in the world. Because especially with your first suit, you're like, hey, this is so cool. I've got armor. I'm going to put it on. And when I think back to some of my stuff, like my first samurai armor suit was off of eBay and I've still got pictures from where I wore it for Halloween. There was no mail on the sleeves. The cote didn't fit properly. Like, the whole thing was just kind of a mess. I wore the padded belt over top, which almost everybody does. And if I remember right, you wore the padded belt over top of yours because that's what it comes with. If you don't
Captain
order the Sagarashi. What's that?
Captain Underpants.
Exactly. Yeah. Underpants on the inside out. And, it's one of those things where I kind of stumbled onto it because so much of the samurai material is in Japanese and I can't read or speak Japanese with very few exceptions of, I know a handful of terms for swords and a little bit for the martial arts, and I can hold my phone up and do Google Translate if I've got something printed that I want to look at and get a real rough translation. But actually, a lot of the parallels between the European armor and the samurai armor stuff, the European armor drags real heavy on your shoulders and everything. And what I learned later on was doing things like when you put on the mail, you actually lift your arms up and have somebody secure a belt. And there's also a type of garment that actually pulls the weight from the legs off of your shoulders and down around your hips, because it cinches in real tight around the hips, which lets the shoulder straps actually sit up a little bit, so you're not holding everything on your shoulders. And even though the samurai armor is about half of the weight, it's actually the same sort of principle, using that padded belt around your waist so that you can really cinch down the actual dough to it, and then wrap the sirashi to tighten it. When I'm actually wearing the armor, I can actually slide my fingers in between the watagami on the sides. So it's taking that weight from being on my shoulders and putting it on my hips. And I can wear that for 7, 8, 9 hours, and I can be perfectly fine at the end of the day. It's very, very little strain compared to having it on your shoulders like that. But in the beginning, I was like, yeah, padded belt goes on top.
I found that. So I have 2 sets of armor. The Romance of Men one was not the first one, but it was the first one that I think I got any feedback on and, learned maybe how to put on properly. And that was also sized to me with some effort anyway. Mm-hmm. The Hanwei set of armor is, I think, made for a smaller person. And I certainly got a chance to feel where some of it may provide discomfort, and it gave me some perspective on where to look. Wearing it publicly also allowed people to tell me, like yourself, I think it was probably you that said your underpants are on the outside right now, my dude. Maybe the belt goes on the inside. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, like, it absolutely makes a huge difference. You wouldn't expect that, like, because the padded belt is not super robust. Like it's right. I mean, it's thick, but like you wouldn't expect it to have the impact that it does. But it really does make the at least a part of the weight rest on your hips. It keeps the metal from digging in or providing any kind of discomfort. And it definitely changes, like, you can move and pivot at the hips, and it doesn't feel, because the weight is spread out, like it's really pulling you around anywhere.
Yeah, and it's hard to describe sometimes, because, you think, all right, I can get my hand under here, that's taken some of the weight off, but it goes past that too, to things like the kote. When you have the kote laced up and the dough is sitting there and the shoulder straps on the watagami are like that, it can help make the kote start sticking. And you're like, wow, I can't move my arms that much, because the weight of the dough is sitting down there also pulling it down. So once you get that popped up a little bit, you can rotate the kote better, because then it can actually slide the fabric across you, whereas before the dough was holding it down. So it's one of those things that seems like a small thing, but it's a world of difference in the comfort. It's almost as much of a difference as having a one size fits not you and then armor that's actually made to you. It's that much of a difference in mobility, at least in my experience with it.
Yeah, I would say before, I don't know. It's weird. It is strange to describe, but it before, the armor felt like wearing a backpack, and then when I put that belt on, it felt like, I don't know, like the weight all of a sudden became more spread out. It wasn't cumbersome to bend over. There were weird things about the armor though, like the headpiece. I'm not exactly sure how I'm supposed to tie the straps. There's a big cord that runs around. Mm-hmm. And like, you can tie it under your chin, but it feels like it's long enough and should wrap around. But if I wrap it around the back, then I feel like I'm kind of strangling myself. And if I just tie it at the chin, it doesn't feel like really sufficient. I'm not sure where that goes. And I also noticed that what are the shoulder pads?
The sode?
Yeah, those would move around. Like, sometimes they would just kind of go behind me. And someone pointed out that, like, hey, you're meant to be able to do archery in the armor. They're supposed to do that. They should kind of get out of the way if you want them to. But I found them kind of out of the way all the time, and they would just kind of default to my back rather than kind of being at my shoulder area.
Yeah, and that's common with the repros. Some of the later period armors, they would actually have more shaped sode, where instead of being kind of rectangular shaped, they would taper in a bit so it actually comes in closer on your arm, and they would have more curvature at the bottom. So its natural inclination is to kind of sit more on your arm instead of sliding around like a board. I have that problem really bad with the O-sode, because they actually mount to a ring in the middle. They're not even attached at the front and back. So they have a really big tendency to just kind of slide off the back. They actually changed some of the ways that they did the kote on it. They actually have kote that had the sode integrated into them, They had some armors that actually had the Watagami straps and a small piece off the side called a kohiri, which is a winglet, and they didn't have sode. So there's a lot of different varieties to the historical armor, but with the reproductions, we tend to see the most popular and most common ones all over the place. And unless you start digging into what are these other types, what did they have, sometimes even for different clans. Some clans preferred, like the Sendai Do was very popular for the Date clan, which is a single piece breastplate here in the front that's kind of peaked, and it's very synonymous with them. A lot of people have seen Date Masamune from media and everything, where he's got that swoopy half crest to it. He was on the Sengoku Basara anime, if anybody's seen that. But he pops up in a lot of stuff. He's in Neo and Neo 2. Yeah, a whole lot of differences in the armor, and all of those can change and impact how it feels to wear it. And it's always an interesting experience with that, because kind of like with the European stuff here, this one has the large pauldrons with the pieces sticking up. It's got the arms that rotate because it's a mid to late 16th century type of armor. But there's coat of plates. There's the separate arms, from the shoulders, whereas these are attached. There's smaller ones that are spalders instead of pauldrons, and all of that feels different to wear and to fight in. And I'm sure the samurai had their own preferences for things like that, which is where we get these evolutions and changes from as well.
Is there a style of armor in the samurai period that you prefer wearing?
I really like the I'm drawing a blank on it, but it's the Kiritsuki Kozani, which is sort of the simulated scales. There's Han Kozani, in which each of these scales is actually an individual piece rather than a board that has the simulated scales on it. But that stuff is very, very pricey because it's all the individual scales instead of a single one. I just really love the classic look of, the Odoshi and having all the lacing and the bright colors to it. But it's a lot easier to wear the Tosei Gusoku or the modern style armor that has less lacing. It's got the solid breastplate. It's just easier to wear because that was designed after they had gone from mounted combat down to foot combat. And this one is sort of an in-between for that. It's kind of a throwback to the Oyuroi, which is the very boxy mounted archery type before the Mongol invasion. But it had some resurgent back in the early Edo period and possibly the late Sengoku. I'm a little bit fuzzy on the timeline with that one off the top of my head. But it was one of those things. It was popular. They brought it back, just like, bell bottoms go in and out and stuff. They had stuff, especially ceremonial, like all of the lacing. You can't beat the appearance of it for that. Tosei Gusoku, a lot easier to maintain, a lot easier to wear. It's more designed for mobility, especially because they were doing firearms and things at that point as well. But I love the look of all the extra Odoshi like that.
Odoshi, I'm not familiar with that word.
Oh, sorry. Odoshi is the lacing. So all the lacing.
Okay. I recall from the armor exhibit that I went to, there was an example of one that looked, I'm going to see if I can actually find it.
Okay, take a quick look for that, and then to circle back to your question about the kabuto, we can have a side chat or something if you want about tying it. A lot of times I'll actually untie it to show you here. A lot of times people will put it on and then, like you said, just kind of tie it under the chin. Well, it still wobbles a lot because there's not much holding it in place. These loops here on the side with the common 3-point suspension, pull them down like this. So it makes a little bit of a loop here on each side. Pass the cord under your chin and through the loop, and then do the same thing on the opposite side. And that'll actually help pull it down, because now with the tension on the loops here, it's putting pressure on all three of the points here that'll help hold it in place. When you have your mempo here, you can tie it off like that, and you can tie it off, tuck the excess up underneath of here. I've seen it where they do like a square knot where there's one under the chin and one in front. There's a variety of different ways to tie the kabuto. And I think some of those would be somewhat of a clan secret, because if the enemy knows how your helmet's tied, they know how to untie it in battle. And not that that's a very, good strategy during a battle, but it's one of those things, if you get in close and you're reaching at something and you know their cord isn't secured very well, or you know how to pull on it, it can be the difference between life and death. Yes. Yes, that is one of those styles where it's just got all of the odoshi. That's one called, I believe it's, I'm drawing a blank. It's Miyogi Neo or something like that, but it's a term. Each of the different patterns for the odoshi has a naming to that, and Miyogi Neo or one of those I think might be fading to black, but it's a term for the fading where it starts off with a light color and then kind of goes to the other. I wanted to do similar with mine where I have the dark green and light green, but the only two lacing colors they have in green were light green and dark green. So I couldn't do like really light green, normal green, dark green, and darker green, because that would have given even more of a popping effect to it.
Yeah, I recall seeing this set, and the name of the museum continually eludes me. Fortunately I could say it in the video, but if you were in Dallas, then go check it out. You lucky devil. Free museum to go check out samurai armor.
Yeah, that's the Gabriel Barbier Mueller. I might be slaughtering the pronunciation, but that's roughly how you say it.
But I remember seeing this armor set there, and more like, it doesn't, the way it's described anyway is that it was really, really special to have all of this kind of silk. I think from a modern textile perspective, like the change in color and the amount of silk, like it seems like the steel would be more valuable, in that it's not but this was quite a piece of bling back in the day.
It was, and for their steel, for the armor, all of their really good steel was going into the swords. Of course, they made some junk swords too, but the majority of the good steel went into the swords. And some of the suits, much like with the European suit, where a breastplate could be twice as thick in the center as it is at the edges because they were hand hammering it and they could actually thin it out as it went out. Some of the suits, it may be the center of the osode or other pieces in, even the do. Some of those will be steel and the others will be leather, which is what they call nirigawa. So they were actually taking just a hardened leather rawhide and using that for some of the scales, which reduced the weight, but you could still lace it and make it look nice. But if it's hanging over, the top of your shoulder, that's not as critical of an area. And saving that little bit of weight certainly helps, because samurai on average tended to be a lot smaller than a knight as well. So the difference in the weight of the armor is also a big factor in who's actually carrying it around. 45 pounds isn't too much to me at 5'10" and 225 pounds, but 70 pounds is. But 45 pounds is a lot if you're 5'6" and 140 pounds.
That is fair. The what I tried to get while I was there, and the museum is not really geared to feature this, but you can get around some of the displays and see them, is what it looks like underneath, right? And one of the little nuances that, I guess I get tickled by with Japanese stuff is if I see this raised rim, I would guess this is like a brass or a brass alloy of some kind, this rim that's been kind of pounded around this area here.
Yeah, it's the same as this. They call it fukurin, which is the brass or decorative edging that helps protect the edges of it. Sometimes if you see a little bit of a curve like that, almost none of the modern repros actually have lacquer on it as it normally would historically. But with the historical plates, they would actually curve the edges a bit and then put lacquer over top, which would thicken up the plate to help it resist cuts, but it would also provide some protection from the elements, because Japan in a lot of places is very humid and the armor would be subject to rust. And especially the plates underneath of the lacing, places where it's going to retain water, you're out, you're marching, you're sweating, that gets into the lacing gets wet, the wet is on the steel, and it can start to rust the steel from, the not quite the inside out, but underneath of the lacing and such, which you would almost never see. So getting them lacquered was an important aspect of that armor as well.
There's the outside look, and I can respect that this looks pretty, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the inside look, if I zoom into this this photo that I took, which incidentally these are photos that I took while I was there, the rim is curled over on the inside. It's not going to like snag on your clothes. It looks like there's some sort of hide or some sort of padding on the inside. And if I go to the shoulder strap here, there's like a big leather pad on the inside. And the examples that I've seen of the reproductions, it's pretty much just sheet metal that's painted, but there's not like a shoulder pad that rolls around. And maybe they weren't all like that. It's tough to say. But this example clearly has like something to make this rest on your shoulders comfortably. which I don't commonly see on reproductions. Have you seen any that have like this kind of pad that rolls around the shoulder? Maybe you can kind of see it. This looks like the metal, and then underneath there's this kind of leather bit that looks like it's made to make you not unhappy for long periods of time while you're wearing it.
Yeah, that's one of those things that evolved a lot over time too. If I remember right, with your armor, it's kind of the hybrid between the two different class styles. There's something called the Tate Airy, and I'm not sure if you can see it online, but if you can see the little bit of the padded collar here underneath, this is actually attached to the Watagami. So it's fabric that's in 2 layers and also has kikogani along the edge of the shoulder, sitting up vertically and a little bit over the top of the shoulder. And that can sometimes be attached to the armor to make it a little bit more comfortable. Sometimes if they're wearing an under kimono and an over kimono and they have 2 or 3 layers of fabric, then they wouldn't worry about padding the straps because the padding is just there in your undergarments. There are certain types of kote for the armored sleeves that were actually worn somewhat like a vest, and the padding for the shoulders was actually attached to what you would put on underneath of the do, so you wouldn't see it attached to the do. So there's a lot of varieties of it. Ashigaru armors in particular, for the rank and file, they would probably have just regular bare steel for that because their stuff is bottom of the barrel. It's got to work. It's got to keep them from getting killed, but nobody really cares if they're uncomfortable for the most part. So it runs the gambit on that. I've seen really fancy silk brocade, underneath with all the kikogani in it, and I've seen just raw steel.
I think my rank at my work might be Ashigaru. That would nobody. I think that describes my life. Nobody cares if I'm uncomfortable.
And it's one of those things, if you wanted to get it, I mean, I don't want to be the person plugging stuff here and all, but Iron Mountain Armory will actually sell the Tate Airy separately. So you can tell them what color fabric you want for it, what color you want for the trim, what color you want for the cross lacing and everything. And you can actually just sew it directly to the Watagami. Yours may have the holes pre-punched in it. It's only attached in a small thread loop at 2 or 3 points along the shoulders on the inside and outside. So it's not fully sewn down. It's just enough to hold it in place for moving around when you're wearing it. Mine's actually popped from a few years worth of wearing it, and I got to sew it back down. So it's something that's very easy to pick up and add to it if you wanted.
That's helpful to know. I don't know how often I'm gonna wear the armor. I'll admit that since the review, which has been a season now, basically, I haven't put the armor back on. It sits prominently on display, and my wife actually gets mad if I take it away. So we have this weird little nook, which probably was featured in the video.
Mm-hmm. I'm
not sure what that nook is for. When we bought the house, I was like, oh, I could put a suit of armor there. And she was like, but then I got a nice looking suit of armor and I put it on display there. And like, if I take it away, she actually kind of is like, when are you putting that back? Like, it feels weird without it. And it certainly draws attention. I don't know. Part of me thinks that like a suit of armor on display basically in your living room is a bit, I don't know. It draws attention to my hobby, and sometimes people get weird about it, but I don't know. Like, she likes it, and it certainly is a conversation piece, and people think it's pretty cool. So as an interior decorating decision, it seems a hefty investment to do that, but it's worked out pretty well. I've been surprised at the positive feedback and the interest my family has shown in having a suit of armor on display in the living room. Because usually my collection and interests are sequestered to some dark corner of the basement where nobody can see it, and so
sure,
it's nice to have that. But the suit I don't wear very often, basically, is the gist. And when I do, like, I could, it seems like if I went for 5 miles or so, which I'm not going to go on a campaign in it, if I did, I would probably be more inclined to add something to increase the comfort at the expense of weight. But for me, like, the lack of all the panache and stuff on the inside really isn't problematic, because 5-7 miles or something like that a few times a year, it doesn't seem to be problematic. Have you done longer runs, times out, gone to a Ren fair, used it multiple days in a row or something like that? And have you found any problems from doing that?
I haven't done the multiple days in a row thing, but my local Ren fair has an unofficial tradition that on the very last day, you wear something completely wrong to Ren Fair. And it started with the cast, where the fair set in the 15th century, and some of the cast would wear clothing from the 14th or 16th century and be like, haha, the nerds found us out, which spilled over into, well, let's just do pirates or whatever. And then the patrons started doing it. They're like, you know what? It's late October, so we're getting close to Halloween. So everybody breaks out the costumes. You can see Santa Claus, you can see the Easter Bunny, the Grinch, like stormtroopers in kilts, pirates with kilts, like almost any crazy manner of stuff. And I've done the samurai armor thing a few years for that. And that's out there, you know, for the day, walking around. I think it's, it's 10 to 6, and we usually cut out somewhere around 4 or 5. So 6 or 7 hours in the armor, walking around the fair. We go from place to place. We stop for pictures when people ask us and everything. So I don't know what the total miles is. I'm sure it's a few miles at least. It might be like 5 or 7 or something. But again, that's spread over like 5 to 7 hours. But I can wear it all day, and I'm still perfectly fine when I pop it off. No problems.
You get hot?
It doesn't get too hot because it's late October. You get a little bit of that like sweaty under the armpits thing. But, you know, the cote tie on, the dough breeze on the side. So it breathes a whole lot more than something like this guy over here will. So there's a little bit of getting warm, but like I'm already calibrated to this. So that's always a walk in the park for me for the most part.
That's fair. I'd imagine just the shine, the reflective nature of a lot of the armor that you would put on for European stuff would probably bake you in the sun a little bit more, being wrapped in a suit of tinfoil.
Yeah, because the steel retains heat, and then it's closer to your body, and it's just it's a whole thing like that. But I was thinking about what you're saying about not being able to wear the suit. And I mean, obviously Take Me is not a good influence on this, but if your wife doesn't want you moving the suit that's on display, that sounds to me like implicit clearance to just get another suit that you can wear and put wherever you want too.
That, you know, I didn't hear that before, but I think I hear it pretty clear now. Like,
good.
That might just be permission to buy another suit. I'll have to see. Now it's funny too, because it dawns on, like, I review swords, and some of them are quite expensive on the internet, and sometimes they share my collection, and people get the impression that I have a lot of money versus just make poor financial decisions. And so it certainly dawns on me, like, I am a professional person. I go into the office. I have to put on pants when I go there. Mm-hmm. And the suit of samurai armor is by far the most expensive suit that I own. Like, oh yeah, I think it is more than the totality of every other suit I've ever owned, and still probably more than double.
I think I'm in that ballpark too. You know, I got this one for my 40th birthday, and I saved up for about 18 months, just setting aside some money every month, and then, you know, had all that to go in, so that when I had a little bit more, I was like, all right, let's go ahead and do it. You're only 41. So I got the suit of armor. I set up a photo shoot with a bunch of friends. So we actually got 4 guys in samurai armor and 4 guys in medieval European armor, and did the whole like knights versus samurai and little individual like knight photo shoot and samurai photo shoot. And it was a lot of fun, and I'm really glad that I did it. So, you know, I've got the armor, might as well make use of it.
So you got the armor sized to you, right?
Correct. Yes.
So does that make you not want to like change shape because you've invested a lot in having a suit that like fits you at a particular size? You're like, I can eat 12 tacos, but no more.
I mean, the struggle is real. The struggle is definitely real. It's a lot harder with the European stuff because, you know, the size of that arm is the size of that arm. If I lose too much weight, it's too floppy. If I gain too much, I physically straight up can't even fit into it. At least with the samurai armor, you know, the arms lace up. There's nothing solid underneath. So the arms have a lot of flexibility in it. The haidate, they sit over top of your thighs. It's not encasing your leg 3/4 like this is. The greaves on this go all the way around. So if I do, you know, too much on the treadmill, I can't fit into my greaves. There was a point where I was doing training on the treadmill when I was doing, you know, getting ready for tournaments and everything, doing 8 pounds on each ankle and 3 pounds on each wrist. My calves got too big to fit in the armor, and I had to actually cut my pants off like a capri and wear the greaves directly over top of my skin because I'd gained, you know, it was like 10 pounds or something, but 10 pounds of muscle, and it was enough to really throw it off for that. So The samurai armor is a little bit more adjustable, so I'm not as worried about it. But yeah, I mean, I got to stay within a finite range if I want to be able to fit into stuff properly.
You're like, I've invested in this shape. I can't be diverted. I'm sorry, honey. This is perfection. This.
Yeah. I mean, if I need to do the 12 tacos, I do the 12 tacos, and then I just don't eat for 2 days, and it kind of balances out, you know?
I can respect it. I can imagine, because the suit of armor, I was very fortunate to get a review sample of armor, but it does dawn on me like it's a pretty substantial investment in a suit, and I have, over the course of my tenure reviewing things, changed shape quite a bit. And when I was a smaller man, the previous suit of armor that I had did not fit me well and still hurt. If I try to wear it now, I imagine it's going to be, muffin topping in samurai armor is not necessarily the most positive experience in someone.
No.
So yeah, having a suit that's made for my size is certainly helpful, but it does make me not want to like change size very much. I'm going to shift over to comments here a little bit, because the last live stream I did, I neglected comments, and I felt like
I totally forgot about the comments.
Buying samurai armor sizes scares me size-wise, because Japanese men don't come 6'2". Well, Samurai Bird, it seems like you can send your measurements in, and they will make it to your size. So you can get some stuff that will fit you, and then you can cut bamboo and do some cool stuff in your backyard with your armor on. I will say it's a together event, though. So they make sizes for you, but they don't make armor that is going to be easy to put on by yourself. So you will have to get your wife to put armor on you. My wife helps me. She gets mad when I tell her to do it naked, but it doesn't stop me from asking. I encourage you to do the same.
Yeah, I've got 2 videos. One is how to get dressed in the armor on your own, and one's how to do it with a friend. It's a lot better to do it with a friend, because you can really refine where the kote are going to sit and get things fitting properly. I'm able to at least dress myself to some extent, which is, why I'm able to do some of these YouTube videos with it, because I have to dress myself. Everybody else is asleep or doing stuff. So if I couldn't dress myself, I couldn't do it for a lot of these videos. But, to Bird's question about that they didn't make armor for 6'2" men, they didn't, unless they were that size. But what they'll do is, as far as I know, Iron Mountain Armory, what they'll do is, if this armor was made for somebody 5'6", each layer of the scales might be 2.5 inches tall. And if you're 6'2", they'll make it 2 3/4 inches tall. So you have the same visual effect. You still get the same number of layers. You still get the same odoshi, lacing for it. It's going to look like it's stretched out a little bit, because that's what they're doing. The other alternative would be adding a whole other row of scales, but then that can start to look a little bit weird, especially when you get into the lacing patterns. If you're looking at some that had a specific series of colors and it was designed for 4 rows, but then you have 5 rows, then your colors get a little bit off. If it's all one color, it doesn't matter. If you're getting something that's, a Tosei Gusoku with the modern style that's a solid breastplate, it's not going to matter as much. But they can get you set up with all sorts of different sizes. I saw one suit that he had shared with me that they made for a guy that I think was like 6'4" and over, or roughly 400 pounds. So, they can fit pretty much anybody for that.
Bird's got another question. Did they use bamboo in the making of armor?
So, common question that comes up, and this is one of those, I'm not going to say like gray areas, but one where you at least need to draw a line on things. There was some bamboo/wooden armor that was in Japan, but it goes way back to, I believe, during or before the Heian period, which is centuries before samurai ever came around. So did they have wooden or bamboo armor? Yes. Did samurai ever wear it? Probably not. If they did, it would have been a fringe case of like, hey, check out my great-great-great-great-grandfather's armor that I got to be in this like play or something. But they would have never worn it on the battlefield, because it would be completely impractical at that point in time.
Why? Sorry. Yes, it would have been. We're getting some, I'm reading through, sorry if I'm missing comments. Kilts, cats living with the dogs, katanas with cross guards. It's madness. That sounds like a Shad video. There's been
furries, there's been like adult babies. I can't even begin to recite the list of all the crazy I've seen over the years going there, because I've gone to that fair for almost 25 years.
Scott says wearing armor in Japan in August was one of the worst experiences I've ever had.
Yep, it is definitely rough when it's warmer out.
So I wore primarily the armor that I had. The treks that I did were in cold or, well, cold by most people's standards, right? So Minnesota in August, not August, October, when I did like a Halloween walk with my family, it didn't draw so much attention. And later I did like another 5 miles or so in like pulling my son along, but it was while it was snowing. And I didn't feel the need to wear like any extra coat or anything, but I had like, thicker layers on underneath. I wasn't trying to reduce the layer count or anything. I had some stuff on underneath, and the layering really made it pretty comfortable in October in Minnesota and in the dead of winter, because I was walking around like January, February time. I don't think I did any like walks while it was 20 below, but I did definitely do it like while it was snowing, so it's below freezing, and I can imagine that it's very unpleasant. I do remember the Hanwei armor because I tested that in summer, but I am basically like, if it's over 70 degrees, I look perpetually like I walked out of a pool when I'm outside. So I'm made for cold weather. If it gets basically above 70 degrees, I start sweating. So it's no surprise that if I'm wearing a steel suit in the middle of summer that it's sweaty. But I'm curious.
I've done the samurai armor in the snow for one of my videos, just out there cutting stuff and playing around. And like you said, it's not too bad as long as you're moving around with it. I didn't have anything extra. I had, the undershirt and the arming garments, and that was it. And it was pretty good. I was out there for maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours, but it was still fine. The summer weather, the hot can get to you. But, this guy back here, when we started doing our Ren Fair performances for the Ren Fair that we work at versus the one that we go to for fun, I was down there the first season. It hit over 95 degrees multiple times. We were doing 3 shows a day spread out over 6 hours, and I was in the suit the whole time. I have straight up fallen asleep, sitting up in a chair wearing that suit of armor because of the heat and everything. So after that, the samurai armor, like in the warm, it's uncomfortable, but I've got that bar where I'm so far calibrated past that. I'm like, this is uncomfortable and I'm sweating, but it's still not as bad as the time that.
Yeah, I haven't gotten that, but it wouldn't surprise me if I was doing a similar experience. I've gone out to test in the Hanwei armor in summer, and I remember doing that, and I remember it being quite hot because the armor stank, and I had to Febreze it. Which incidentally, Febreze, if you stink up your armor, I can say that it works.
It does.
But I that's not any different than like if I wore a sweater outside in the summer.
Yeah.
You mentioned though that yours breathes pretty well if you're moving out there, and you don't tend to get, it doesn't look like you jumped in the ocean.
I mean, I still get sweaty and everything, but I've got one of the larger under what they call the Yoroi Hidatari, which is the undergarment. So I've got the larger sleeves with it. So sort of when I'm kind of doing this, it's making its own, like a tiny little billowing effect inside. So I don't have that like swamp armpit going on that you get sometimes when something is real close fit and there's no air circulation. So moving around a little bit or just walking and moving my arms like that, there's like a small breeze that takes it from really uncomfortable to just somewhat uncomfortable. But I still get the whole sweating and everything else going on. Thank goodness for having paint inside the mempo and everything. And, it mostly pulls up in there. I'm not sure if yours has it or not. Some of the higher tier armors actually have a hole in the mempo at the bottom. That's actually for draining sweat out to keep it from pulling up in there.
I don't know. I didn't look at that. That's interesting. But now that you mention it, if I bring up like a picture, this is there's a name for the terminology, but it's a cross between it's a foreign influence. It's got like this conquistador looking helmet kind of thing, but it's
that one's non-bond armor, which is barbarian armor.
But like right here, you can kind of see from my photo, I didn't do a great job of photographing it, but you can kind of see the light coming through. And
that looks like it might be. And
It's
that's a good example too, because those two little pegs there at the bottom can actually be used for helping secure the Kabuto helmet cord underneath as well. Yours probably has the hooks on the side because almost every repro does. But that goes back to the point of, sometimes they had slightly different ways of tying it. And in that case, it's got the pegs underneath to help retain the cord under there.
Yeah. Lots of different ways. I wouldn't mind that versus the little hooks on the side, or both. More little doodads to make the thing. The loop trick though is helpful. And none of that is described when they make a picture of like, here's how you put on your armor. It's like, what's the best description? It goes from like, here are underpants, insert leg, and then like, but I feel like I've got two legs through one underpant hole half the time while I'm wearing it. And there's like, well, you didn't say you had to put one leg through each hole. It's like, well, that should be intuitive. Like, but it's not. I've never worn underpants before. I have. This is a bad analogy. Now most of you have a mental image, and I'm sorry, but you get the idea.
Yeah. And a quick comment on the little pegs here and stuff too. So going back to the helmet and pulling down the loop like this, one thing you can actually do if your mempo is loose is you can actually loop that loop underneath of this peg so that when you tighten up your helmet cord, it will actually help pull the mempo up underneath of your chin and keep it in place. That can be a little bit uncomfortable if you don't have some padding inside of the mempo. Mine is an upper tier armor and it didn't come with it, but it's one of those things that, it's easy enough to cut a little bit of foam or something and glue it in here if you wanted to have it. But those pegs on the side here can actually be useful for doing that as well.
I am skipping around comments because I'm bad at them. So in the event that you have commented and I asked a question, I'm sorry. Feel free to ask it again. But I'm skipping through stuff. Fun fact, Mongolians wore silk shirts under their armor so they could pull an arrow out of them by pulling on the silk shirt. I've heard that before, that the silk sometimes an arrow won't penetrate the silk and it might stick into you, but then you could yank on the silk and it would like spring out.
Yeah, with the samurai armor, there's something, I believe it's called a horimono, which is basically a big cape that would flow behind you as you were riding. And it was common with messengers or people who were trying to basically jet from place to place. And that big billowing cape behind them, there's a handful that said that they had like little wooden frames underneath to billow it out. They would be made of silk and strong materials like that to basically help catch the arrow and basically bounce it off or throw it away from, being able to actually be shot in the back instead. So there is something to the arrows and the silk.
I've got the same problem with my Romance of Men suit. One horn side loose. I spoke to Rum. They told me they screwed in the horn, dismantling under the Kabuto. I've heard the same thing. They did mention to me that the loose horn that I had on the suit of armor that I had was screwed in, and I'd have to do some surgery on it. But personally, I suck at that. I'm not particularly handy. And if there's something where I don't care, and honestly, like I get that like a suit of armor that is free to me, I shouldn't really care about, and it would probably be helpful to go through and make some efforts in repairing it, customizing it, modifying it. At the same time, my wife likes it, so I'm kind of scared to touch it because she's feisty, and when like it's pretty much hers now. But with the next one, if it's screwed up, I can totally do that.
Yeah, don't be afraid of it with this one. The fabric lining in the helmet is just glued in, so you can basically just pop 2 or 3 inches off, basically pull it out a little bit till it unglues, slide your hand up in there with a little stumpy screwdriver, tighten it up, and then put a little bit of glue there, and then just hold it in place till it seals back up. Over time, if you wear the helmet enough, that fabric lining will actually start to come off and deteriorate and stuff. It's just glued in there. There's nothing magic or special to it. So pop it off, put a little bit of glue. Once you tighten the horn, you're good to go.
Sage advice from Samurai James. I've been inspired with courage, and now I might have actually another video to make about armor. How How to fix your horny. I think there's some play on words that I could do that would probably be clickbaity and still interesting.
I think so.
All right. Let's see. Thank you for the super chat, Mr. Fusion. I don't know. Here's $2. I can't argue with that. What I will do is say cheers as I open my next can of Furious. And you've got Pepsi. Cheers.
Yep.
Or it's just stout that you're hiding from your wife.
No, it's regular Pepsi. But I'm on a diet, so it's like a treat.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I have been feeling personally like hot garbage for most of the week, and so I started feeling better last night. Today I felt good mostly, and so naturally I'm trying to screw all that up by having some beers now. But all right, Mr. Fusion, just for the win, just invested $2.
Nice.
The name in Chinese is hard to translate. I know Romance of Men. It sounds somewhere erotic. Yeah, I somebody mentioned when I first did a review on a piece from Romance of Men, they noted that that's not necessarily far off from samurai stuff because apparently there was, I don't know, some diddling of younglings or something. I'm not sure. It's not necessarily like in all the samurai movies that I see where it's like, we will teach you to be a warrior and also let me touch your peen. Like that's not part of the movie. But apparently It happened, and I don't know a whole lot about it. I don't think that's what they were going for, though. In fairness to the name, I think I don't think that's the insinuation. But yeah. Anyway, it's certainly, for what it's worth, right? When I think of the name Romance of Men, I have not talked about any other vendor that has had more people and more comments about the name of the vendor. Like,
yeah. Wakashudo was the whole like samurai and young boy thing. It's the way of something, and I don't remember what it is. I'm cursory familiar with it, like different culture, different time, different whatever. So I won't judge them by modern standards. Not anything I have any interest in, just to be clear. Samurai James, there's lines here. That is one of those. Zero interest in that at all. But I think the Romance of Men thing, like somebody was sitting in a room and they're like, what do we call this? They're like, oh, men love swords and armor. Okay, well, what's another word for love? Romance of men. Here we are.
Yep. I could well be. Or they were like, I'm pretty sure what's the most homoerotic name that we could name a sword company? That could well have been the discussion as well. I don't know, but like I will say from a conversational standpoint, it has gotten people talking. And
yeah, I mean, if they had a slogan like, come stroke our swords or something, I'd have to really be second guessing some of that.
All right. Barbarian armor. You mentioned the names.
Nanban.
Hanban?
Nanban. Nanban.
Nanban armor. I don't think there are many. I haven't seen a reproduction of that style of armor. Have you?
Yeah, Iron Mountain Armory actually has it. It's one of the things that I'm kind of eyeing and saving up for. It's essentially a European cuirass and a European style helmet. I think the one that you showed earlier, I think is called a Cabasset helmet. It's one of the conquistador helmets, like you had mentioned. But that became real popular after the mid 1550s, give or take. I think it was like 1543, maybe, when the Portuguese ended up in Japan and brought firearms, but they also brought over armor. And things like the scale armor don't really resist things like guns, but the breastplate did and the helmet did. So that's one of the reasons that they started integrating some of these. Oda Nobunaga is probably the most famous for, really blending the two together. he's constantly pictured in new stuff having, you know, a solid cuirass, a European style helmet, and then the rest as samurai style armor. But it's a neat little combination. And since I dabble in both types of armor, that's one of those natural evolutions where I really want to see what it feels like to wear something that's a hybrid in between, but like designed to be a hybrid. Not that I just want to pull my breastplate and, you know, sleeves over here and then put it on and be like, yay, this is what it's like.
Yeah, well, that could be like crossover armor done badly. Another content video for Samurai James with your abundance of time.
A friend told me to do it because I won a Halloween costume party one year and then I went back the second year and I won first place in that. And he was like, "What are you going to do next year?" I was like, "I've got nothing." He's like, "Why don't you just mix them?" I was like, that's even stretching like my nerd thing. And he just went, "Okay, well, Stormtrooper," and kind of faded away. I was like, don't get me into a third thing. I don't have the money for that.
I could do it, but I'd hate myself.
Yeah.
This suit of armor, the Nanban armor that you mentioned, I remembered the name for the first time. Some interesting notes about it. You got this conquistador helmet, this star shape, the 6-pointed star, which I don't recall seeing on. It's not a common thing that I recall seeing on armor, but also these Sode. They are turtle shells. They look like turtle shells, and this dough covers the chest and then is like a cloth, and I think there's mail underneath it, but there's like a cloth piece over it, and then I want to say there's some sort of mail that goes underneath. But it's just it's certainly an interesting looking armor from
It is
like a crossover perspective, and the integration of like, let's put some turtle shells over here. The other thing that I noticed about the mail, I'll see if I can find some photos of it here's some more turtle shells because we're on the subject. There's the Sode. You've got the little hair shapes around them. They have hinges and whatnot in them. Kind of the Japanese metal working on the pattern of the helmet as well.
Yeah, the etching.
Here we go. This will work. But this was the kind of the tightness of the mail. So you can see that these are all little butted mail pieces, but they're also really, really tightly done. And I don't often see reproductions that integrate this kind of tightness of pattern. It's not going to hold back a thrust particularly well, but it'll certainly absorb a cut pretty well, which I think was more.
Yeah, that one in particular is actually related to the armor that it's with right there. So that's Nanban Kusari, which is essentially a 4-in-1. So there's a center ring with 4 rings attached on each of it. And that's a very European or Middle Eastern way of weaving the mail, which is why you don't really see it too much on the reproductions. The typical Japanese way, there's a handful of ways, but the one that we usually see with the reproduction stuff involves the 2 oval rings coming out in that plus pattern with the circle in the middle. So you see that flat sort of a circle with a plus all the way around it. Whereas with this, you have all of the circular shapes of the rings stacking up like that. So that's why that looks like a completely different and more dense pattern to the mail. It's a completely different way of weaving it. There's handfuls of example where that's actually riveted as it was in European. And there's still debates to this day about whether the Japanese figured out how to do that on their own or if it was a post-European influence.
One thing that fascinates me about the Japanese armor are some of these small details, though. And as I circulate through some of the photos that I've taken, in almost every little instance of this armor, which in fairness is like a collection of important armors, armors that were saved. Armors were not preserved necessarily to the same degree as swords were. They're not as culturally significant as I understand it. The materials used may not have withstood time as well. But in their period, they certainly received a substantial amount of attention. And there's just the examples that I see of European armor in museums can certainly rival and certainly can be extremely detailed and ornate and have very intricate metal work. But even some of the more base armors here, like all had this artistry in like every inch of the armor everywhere. And it's, I'm sure they all, Japanese armor also came in shit quality.
Oh, yeah.
But it's fascinating to see the examples, the variety that's in there, and just all in particular the metal work and the amount of engraving and plating and, well, really the metal work I find I don't know all the terms necessarily, but like I see that this is, pounded in, and there's all sorts of, the highest echelons of European armor seem to have a lot of the same similarities and can be also quite a spectacle visually. But like these are not necessarily like the armor of kings or noblemen. Well, probably noblemen, but not necessarily super high up the rank. And there's a lot more examples of them, it seems. And the metalwork is really, really intricate.
Yeah, that's repoussé is the name of it in European context for raising stuff up like that, where they sometimes do the artificial eyebrows and things like that, etching and engraving where they're detailing in the metal. And it is a difference with a lot of the samurai stuff versus the European, because since the European is composed of so much steel, it simply holds up to time better. Whereas the samurai stuff, once the lacing starts to deteriorate, you put it on display in front of a window and it starts getting, basically aged and weakened from all the UV rays of the sun. These plates are all held up simply by the lacing. So once that lacing deteriorates, the plates will start to fall off. So you can find antique pieces of armor that have just the top half because the lacing is just busted and it's fallen off. Or you find a doe that only has half the skirt because the lacing is just faded and fallen apart. The arms, the fabric gets rough on those. The, suniate, the haidate, that's all steel attached to fabric. But when you're trying to get 500, 600, 700-year-old fabric, sometimes time is just too harsh to it, especially because, like you said, they weren't really concerned with preserving a lot of this sort of stuff. Now, we have great examples from things that went to shrines and other places that were preserved, but a lot of it just sort of, kind of rotted away, or it sat in, the family's home, and there's nobody that's still around in the 18th and 19th century that was repairing or fixing the armor. It starts to fall apart. They probably just tossed it. I mean, I hate to think that because it hurts me.
But I get it. You mentioned the loss to time, and I have this photo up, and it struck me as I'm going through it that this was gold plated underneath the lacquer because gold doesn't rust and it preserves the metal. So due to some of the lacquer cracking, they could see that the under construction of the metal, the metal was gold plated underneath the lacquer to add some rust and like time resistance, which is really fascinating to see that, like, it's gold underneath the lacquer.
Yeah, it's a neat thing. And some of the things with Japanese armor, when you look at it from a modern context, you see some of the suits and they have that sort of russet brown look to it and it looks a little bit rusted. And we see it and we're like, wow, that's a janky armor. It's starting to rust up. It looks like trash. Back then, in some cases, it was actually taken to be a sign of a very important armor, because what that said is, this is rusting and this whole suit is actually iron compared to some of y'all that are running around with half iron and half Nirigawa with the leather. So it was a status symbol to be able to say this whole thing is actually steel.
Yeah. This is this I'm sure was a pretty high level helmet, but like the amount of metalwork and engraving, because all of this little patterning is not cast. It's all
right.
It's all a piece of metalwork that is filed out, with the little engraver piece and a hammer. Very, very meticulously done. And under here, my photo doesn't highlight it well, but all of this little stippling around is Nanako, and there's like a little punch that creates a circle imprint, and it's all done that way. And here you can kind of see some of the embellishments on the. It's just thinking about doing this with like tools from the $10 Home Depot section are
right.
Absolutely incredible. And you can see that the gold on this one wraps all the way around to, in an attempt to preserve it. It looks like somebody whacked it with a hammer too. I promise I didn't do it.
No, that's a style that some of them went and they changed, and the skull profile changed for that. Some of them had kind of the squared out back. Other ones were much more rounded. Zunari was the one that was kind of baseball helmet type shape. I'm drawing a blank on what the one for that is. That's kind of the squared off back. But some of those were the signs of different armorers and things as well. Different armoring schools, I should say.
Mr. Fusion has donated another $5. Cheers, Mr. Fusion. I've got yes, I have $7 now to put towards a new set of armor. YouTube, granted, probably takes a cut, but I appreciate it all the same.
$7 more than you had to start with, so every little bit goes a long way.
I can buy the beer that will get me drunk enough to maybe click the buy button. That's all right. What? Here we go. Samurai James, do you study any Japanese sword arts or Budo?
So good question. Where I'm at, there's pretty much nothing around me. I did take karate back in high school. I got a couple medals from that, although high school is so long ago, I don't remember what they were for, but I have the medals to at least show for it. It's one of those things that I would like to do, but unfortunately, life just doesn't permit for that right now. Even if I had some nearby, I've got a baby that's 7 months old. I've got a 3-year-old. So just general family life is pretty busy right now. I've been doing HEMA. I started 11 or 12 years ago, but I've only made it to class a couple times in the last few years between the pandemic and having a baby and having another baby. I do every now and then try to catch some of the videos that are on Let's Ask Seki Sensei that's hosted by Shogo, if y'all have watched him before. So I do like to catch those. It's interesting. I especially like to see how he explains all the techniques and breaks them down, because kind of like we were talking about earlier, I think before we went on the air, of seeing, how different people from different backgrounds and different body styles cut and do things. When I'm doing my cutting demonstrations, I'm not trying to show proper Japanese technique. I'm trying to show, like, does this sword cut a thing or not? My cutting background actually comes from HEMA. I learned to cut with European longswords before katanas, which probably influences some of that as well. But I love to see a little bit of the comparison, because I can sometimes point out and be like, we do that in HEMA too. Or, well, sucks that there's only a single edge on that sword, because with HEMA, we could just pop back up with the reverse edge. So I enjoy watching them. I try to keep up with some of that. I've got a handful of books, but unfortunately no formal study for me yet. But maybe that'll change in the future.
Well, before you get your next suit of armor, when you turn 50, if you save up, you can, every decade, Samurai James gets a new set of armor. So
I like that.
Yeah, that's it. Now it's committed. It's been said. It's out in the universe. You mentioned cutting, though, and like the different backgrounds. I think there's maybe, I've probably done something to perpetuate it too, that Japanese sword arts mean that you practice cutting. And it's worth noting that the two arts that I study, one of them never cuts anything, right? And the other one cuts all the time. It's like a real focus of one art, and it's like an inconsequential byproduct of another. And so if I think about my experience in cutting, I study, incidentally, Katori Shinto Ryu, and I study Toyama Ryu, and those are the two arts that I study simultaneously. And so in Katori, at least my experience in learning Katori has been that you do mostly, there's a component of EI where you kind of warm up and start the class doing some Iaido and their Katori's version of EI. And then you kind of jump into two-person drills with a bokken. So you have bokken, and you do bokken versus bokken sword, sword versus bow, sword versus naginata, sword versus sword again, but like it moves from armored combat to like a street clothes kind of thing. And that's more or less as far as I've gotten. Then there's spear. I haven't learned spear. I haven't learned sword, short sword, or just short sword. You could use a wakizashi or a tanto in place for either of those. I haven't learned those parts yet, despite doing it the better part of a decade. Haven't gotten there yet. It's a slow climb. But most of those are two-person kata drills. And so you certainly learn really important facets to fencing and swordsmanship, preserving the center line. And for those of you that don't like swing swords at other people, some of this is not going to make sense. But for HEMA people that swing swords and have it actually hurt, controlling the center line is important, and that will probably resonate with you.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that comes from the kata that we do in Katori. So there's like an immense amount of like kata that seems like first you learn the dance steps, and then you get bored with the dance steps. Then you're like, oh shit, the dance steps are really deep, and you start to like learn things from doing them. And some of them can be useful and important, but you never take a sharp sword and whack a tatami mat. That's just not a thing that I've ever done with anyone in Katori. And a lot of the cuts that we learn in that particular style are effective at cutting, in the sense that they will cut you enough to kill you, cut you enough to get at your arteries and important bits, but they won't like cleave you in two. Mm-hmm. And in contrast, Toyama focuses a lot on really devastatingly hard cuts. And granted, they're made for different times. There's probably reasons to it, and I'm not an ambassador for either art. But what I've learned as a novice student, Toyama focuses on very intense, substantial cuts, and like every cut should be enough to make it through a tatami mat, right? Like an arm or something. But you should be able to lop off an arm versus cut into the artery and then retract your blade. And so nobody. You know, in Toyama, we cut all the time. Like every week, people are cutting. You bring tatami mats all the time. You're constantly trying to do it. And there's certainly then an emphasis on cutting tatami well. And the emphasis doesn't come in cutting through the mat, right? Mm-hmm. It comes in cutting it exactly the way you want it. So they bring out a measuring device that measures exact 45-degree angles. And the angle that you cut should be exactly 45 degrees. Mm-hmm. And so it no longer becomes the challenge isn't cutting the tatami mat. It's cutting it at precise 45-degree angles, exactly where you wanted to cut. And there's a cut called Rokudan Giri, which is 6 cuts on a tatami mat, which is, you know, if you miss and like lop off too much, you can really screw yourself on being able to achieve it. But it's an interesting nuance on cutting. In the sense, like I think people assume that all Japanese martial arts really have some emphasis on cutting. Some of them are really quite private. You don't see a whole lot of them, and they're tough to really understand what the hell is going on and why it's valuable, and not just like dance class when you see it online. And the depth comes with like years of study versus, you know, like a 2-minute YouTube video. And in contrast, the cuts are not impressive. At the same time, I would venture a guess that, like, were you to be wearing a suit of armor like we're talking about, Katori would probably be a more effective art than Toyama, if you're talking about armored combat, because one is made for armored combat.
Yeah, and I've done a little bit of cutting tatami and armor. I'm trying to remember what Rokudan Giri is. It sounds familiar. I can't remember if that's like, you know, diagonal, rising, diagonal, cross, horizontals.
Downward, it can alter slightly depending on which foot you start with, but fundamentally it follows the same pattern of downward diagonal cut, switch your feet, downward diagonal cut, and then downward diagonal cut, switch your feet, upward, or not switch your feet, upward diagonal cut, and then downward diagonal cut, and then horizontal cut.
Oh, okay.
But you switch your feet one time at the start. So that will determine, like, if you take 2 steps in or 3 steps in. This is important for a competitive aspect. Mm-hmm. It'll determine if you take 2 or 3 steps in. So you got to, you know, get your distance right. There's other little nuances to the competitive side of things, like, and I don't compete. I haven't done it. I'm not an expert in it worth calling out, but don't bounce, like, don't prep. You should kind of move fluidly like a machine, but you shouldn't be like, I am here and now I'm prepping.
Yeah.
Let me line up. Like, you have to kind of exactly know where you're going and what you're doing to do well in that sense. But one art focuses in that way and the other doesn't. I find them both to be very valuable, particularly since they focus on very different things. I get a lot more out of both of them. But you mentioned that you learned to cut with a European longsword. And yeah, I learned to cut with a Japanese sword, but it's funny because, like, one art taught me how to cut stuff and the other taught me, like, how not to get cut by stuff.
Yeah, and my background on this is kind of crazy. I learned my first cutting with tatami at a HEMA event under Mike Edelson using a longsword. But Mike Edelson used to be a Japanese martial arts instructor, and he learned how to cut with a katana and then started teaching under the longsword. And my current HEMA teacher actually started off teaching Japanese martial arts, eventually went out of that and started teaching HEMA. So I've got like European based people who started off in Japanese martial arts, which is why I always wonder, like, with the sequence of cuts and things, seeing some of the parallels between it of like, we do that in HEMA, but that came from the Japanese martial arts with it. And the same sort of things you're saying, like making sure like in competition, because I've done a couple cutting competitions, make sure you don't like walk up, figure out your distance, take, practice and measure up and all. Should be, approach, fluid swing, and not a whole bunch of this dance of like trying to get into the exact position to cut stuff. We don't break out, the calipers to make sure it's 45 degrees like that. But, if you make a downward diagonal cut and then the next one over, you make sure that you don't mountain it, make sure you take the proper, cut and then all the way. And then, you don't mountain, so you don't have like a little bit of an angle on the top of it. So we look for those sort of things. But with HEMA, it's more about like, would this have cut if it's 45 degrees or 40 degrees or 50 degrees? That's usually as far as they go with it. We had lots of little gimmicks that I haven't seen in Japanese stuff yet that can be really fun. Like there's one where they put 2 PVCs vertical on the tatami and you have to be able to cut through it with only a 1 foot gap, 6 inches on either side. They've done one where they actually put tatami on wheels on the little stand, and they had 2 people that would drag it back and forth, and you actually had to go from point A to point B and cut while you were moving along. So lots of little fun stuff like that seems kind of like games, but I feel like is a little bit more of an insight into like, cool, I can cut the tatami sitting there, but would I actually be able to do it in a fight, like dynamic and moving and everything? So those sort of things are really fun to me for some probably strange reason, but really enjoy them.
I can see the pros to both, right? Like there's it seems like anyway with the Japanese style sword arts, like a focus on being able to do a set of cuts perfectly at perfect 45-degree angles. It's just a different skill, and it may not be as martial in application and maybe more like a nuance or offshoot or competitive sport aspect of things. But I can appreciate the skill that it takes to really execute those perfect cuts, right?
Oh yeah.
And in the there's the Rokudan Giri that I talked about earlier. There's other cuts as well on a single mat. There's more complex cuts as you go up the ranks as well. There's 2 mats set aside where you have to cut down through 1 mat and then stop and then turn your blade and cut upward and diagonal at the other without basically stopping and then cutting upwards and diagonal. So if you imagine you've done like a V shape across 2 mats, and then you have to cut through both horizontally in 1 swing. And to do that, you have to be able to demonstrate enough control, enough power to generate and cut through a single mat, but enough control to stop in such a way that you have enough space to generate power to cut an upward diagonal cut immediately after, kind of without you drawing the sword back and generating momentum. And then you have to be able to have a wide enough, hard enough cut to cut through both mats, which are separated, by probably 4 feet or so. I can't remember what that is. There's the Tombo cut where you have it's called Tombo's Dragonfly, but you have like a partial piece of mat that's cut.
Yeah, across the top.
Yeah, setting freestanding, so it's not secure. There's nothing holding it down other than its own weight. And you have to cut both ends of the mat. And it's when you see somebody do it well, it seems like, oh, that's not hard. But as soon as you hit a mat, like it kind of flings itself across the room. So to cut a mat that isn't supported, while it's held horizontally, downward, diagonally, and then cut it clean enough where it stays long enough to cut the other side of it and move quick enough to do that is quite a feat.
It is.
There's other things like cutting. Phil Martin does. Akitika channel does this enough. I think Phil Martin. Phil cuts an upward diagonal cut, and then like the top part of the mat stays stationary long enough for him to come around and do another cut. Some version of that is called mizigaishi in Japanese. That's another one. And there's a few different ones in terms of cutting thicker mats and harder mats, but ultimately you're still beholden to cutting those perfectly. So not only are you doing that feat, but you're responsible for doing it at angles that are good. And if you cut it at 60 degrees, you're gonna fail your test, or potentially disqualify yourself from a competition, or lose the competition from somebody who can cut it more accurately.
Yeah, that's an insane skill level. Like I've done a couple double cuts, like the up and then down like that. My success ratio is not very good on that, and I can't even imagine trying to get like an exact angle on it. I'm thrilled just to successfully complete it.
I'm thrilled to make it to the finish line. We're not talking about, yeah. I get what you're saying, and the at the same time, like, they're very structured, and you can practice them and do them and like know them and become familiar with them, and really, I mean, if you're going to go to a competition and that's what you're going to focus on, then like you can practice that cut a lot. What you can't do, and what may be a better mix of luck and skill anyway, is like two random people pulling, a dolly back and forth with a tatami mat on it at a random angle.
Yeah.
You can't really practice that well. And it's fair to say that it's at least more representative of the randomness a battlefield might present, and perhaps a more apt skill of your application of the skill. But I can see value in both. I really like all the randomness that seems to come in the various medieval or the HEMA competitions in cutting, because they seem so varied. There's like paper integration, and there's like stop here, use a PVC pipe, all sorts of different stuff comes in, and I think it's awesome. I see the benefit of both.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and those tend to be like, you get to the top 3 or like the top 6, like it's a bracket elimination at the very top. It's not everybody doing it. So it's, separating the, like, everybody did this particular pattern and nobody's ahead in points or whatever. So, to really just separate out and give like a glamorous end to it. But yeah, having tried some of those, I have immense respect for the people who can nail the angles like that every time when I'm just struggling to complete the cut.
I think there is, as a Japanese style swordsmanship practitioner, I can certainly appreciate if you move my tatami mat around and I'm used to cutting a stationary object, and all of a sudden I'm in a competitive environment where the juices are pumping, right? And then all of a sudden my target's moving around and I have to bob and weave a little bit. There's a challenge to that's unpredictable, unexpected, and certainly appreciable. I think vice versa too. If you don't do that, and the precision has never necessarily been exactly what you're going for. If you cut, for example, you take your pool noodle, go get a speed square, something that can draw a 45-degree angle, and draw 6 45-degree angles on your pool noodle or your water. Well, you're probably not going to get a water bottle with 6 cuts, but a pool noodle, the tatami mat, draw those 6 lines and see if you can hit them exactly,
Okay.
6 times in a row, right? And if you can, maybe you'll have some appreciation. But if you're like a foot off half the time, you'll probably get a better idea. Or if you're like, hey, well, this one was 50 degrees, and you're like, well, that's a failure. Like, you start to, I think, have a deeper appreciation for what seems maybe simple or stupid.
For sure. Like when I'm trying to evaluate swords, not that I've done it nearly as much as the armor stuff, but I'm looking not just did it go through the tatami, did it ruffle it at the end? Is it a good smooth cut? I can tell if I've scooped on it, that's my fault, but I can see if it starts to scoop and stop. Well, all right, well then the sword's maybe not sharp enough. So it's a good medium for figuring out some of that stuff too.
I'm behind on comments. We've got Super Chat again. I'm going to keep donating until he buys it or gets annoyed with my Super Chats. I'm not going to get annoyed with you giving me money, but you don't have to do that, Mr. Fusion. And also, you're going to have to donate a lot more if you want me to click buy on a suit of armor. They're like thousands of dollars. So being $17 closer to it is appreciated, but is still a significant and marriage-ending amount of money off of it. Someone mentioned Armor Fund would be cool if somebody could group fund a Greenswich style plate harness. Greenwich?
Greenwich. It's one of the large armories out in large styles of armory out in Europe. It would probably run 30 to 50 grand for a good repro of it nowadays.
A gentleman I've had the pleasure to meet while he was at Arms and Armor, Josh Davis. He makes armor and is local to me. He lives in Minnesota around me, and I've seen his wares.
You're local out there? I was actually just out there 2 months ago. He's resizing the Italian Milanese suit that I have, so I was out there for 2 days. I had no idea you were nearby.
Yeah, I'm in Minnesota, and so if you come see Josh again, heads up, let's have some beer.
I got to save some money for a suit, but I'll be back out there to bug him again when I can.
Yeah, I remember meeting him while he was working at Arms and Armor, and he's a very talented armorer. He's like, I'm working on this suit of armor, and I was like,
yeah, he makes really good stuff. A few friends of mine have some pieces by him, and they actually pointed me at him when I was like, hey, my armor is not fitting quite right. They were like, why don't you talk to Josh? And I hit him up. He's like, sure, we can do that. Fly out here. So mailed the armor out, flew out, spent 2 days getting stuff, resized, marked off. He's got it out there. It'll probably be back in a few months or something. I'm hoping to get it in time for Ren Fair, but I might not. And if not, that's fine. But yeah, he does fantastic work. I was actually trying to hit up Arms and Armor when we were out there, but they were closed that Sunday for something they had going on Monday. So luckily they didn't take my money for swords, which means more money for armor. So there's that, I guess.
That's a fun place to visit. I always get a kick out of Arms and Armor. I should go there more often, but life and kids. I watched all of Matt's videos twice and still don't know what katana to buy. That is something I can't help you with. I'm sorry. If you watched all of my videos twice,
99% chance if you buy a katana, you're buying more. So there's a point where you don't have to overthink it.
Yeah, eventually you'll get the right one.
Exactly.
My sensei, Rich Sato, spent 10 years teaching us only Ido. We never progressed to mats or even pool noodles. There's a lot of schools like that never really do that. If I only studied Katori, I would have never cut a mat. It was never a facet of the thing. And in fairness, I don't know that you need to, right? There are different schools. I would say that in the event there's a person that studies Toyama and a person that studies Katori, and neither one is familiar with the other, and then all of a sudden they both cut mats, right? Well, the Toyama people are going to seem far more impressive because that's what they do all the time, and they're going to move through the mats well. And the Katori people, more than likely, are going to cut in enough to kill a person, and that is not necessarily at a consistent, accurate angle because that's not what they focus on. And the Toyama people would probably be like, haha, you're not so great at this. And the Katori people would be like, you're right, I'm not, but they're still dead. And that would not be an appreciable fact by one group. And the other would probably be frustrated at their lack of ability to cleave through mats really well. But then all of a sudden, if you went to like a application, they call it Gekken in Toyama Ryu, where you have a sword that's like a foam pad and you whack each other with it. In the event that you are one person is using Katori techniques and the other person is using Toyama, not to say you can't, it just takes an enormous amount more skill to execute Toyama techniques effectively in an applicable sense to like hit the target consistently and get out without being hit than it does Katori, because that's what they focus on. They routinely get boken and whack each other and move fast as fuck, trying to while being in like a series of kata that is scripted, but they learn a lot of moves about like preserving the center line and fencing, and all of that stuff becomes really applicable. And you start to see them move in like a similar speed as people that do kendo, where they like deliver strikes, albeit not going to cleave a man in two, but will bop you in the noodle pretty hard, really, really effectively and quickly. And they're also used to bobbing and weaving and dealing with unpredictable randomness, where the Toyama style, at least insofar as I've studied it, doesn't. So it's not to say you can't learn it though, but like certain arts favor different things. And if you're not getting what you need though, I'd encourage you to branch out, learn, take up another one. I find that they complement each other pretty well. You get a little brain tied doing two at the same time, but eventually you sort it out, or you don't, and they kick you out of both. What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, I did Gekkens once with Mike Edelson about 10 years ago. They're fun. They hit harder than you think when you say foam swords, but not quite like LARP, you know. I had a little bit of a knot on my forearm that weekend after that. But, you know, with the difference in classes like that, HEMA, you see the same thing sometimes. Like there's a lot of general thought that HEMA is like we do all of the things. I know of at least one HEMA school that never cuts tatami at all. I know one that never does ring-in, so they never do any of the wrestling aspect of it. I know one that's heavily tournament focused. They're not nearly as concerned about the source material or trying to recreate the art. They want to know, how do I game the system? You know, what's my, you know, most likely cuts to lead off with, to follow up with, trying to basically play chess on that and win the sword fight, not by trying to experience what it was like back then, but they're literally training to win tournaments on it rather than training to learn the art. So you know, it's the same sort of thing with the Japanese sword art. Some of them have their own focus, and that's totally cool. And luckily, everybody seems to play fairly nice for the most part.
Mr. Fusion, I think I'm going to do the same thing the Let's Ask Shogo on the next stream. Has anyone ever been randomly blocked by somebody famous you never know and haven't done anything? I did find out that Shogo responded to me. I made a video, a short, which admittedly was not my best short. I'm learning shorts, forgive me, but like you have 1 minute to make a point, and I can't make a fucking point in 20 minutes. So it's a struggle for me. He responded to me though, and he did it like a couple months after I made the video, and I never noticed until somebody like called it out recently and was like, "Hey, here's a link, dummy." He responded to you. But no, he didn't block me, and I was like, "Hey, I disagree with you," and he didn't block me. I haven't gotten blocked by anyone randomly famous. I don't think so. Nope. Samurai James, have you been blocked by anyone randomly famous?
Not that I know of, but I don't really talk with a lot of famous people. I guess I'll know the answer if you block me after this live stream, but until
Would
this
you consider
point, no.
me famous?
What's that?
Would you consider me famous?
I mean, when I ask people about, you know, swords and stuff, they're like,
oh, snap.
Sounds kind of familiar.
No, I'm kidding.
Like some people, like they don't quite remember your name, but they're like, "Oh, that's the guy that breaks all the swords." I'm like, "Yes, that's him."
That's him. That's it's a weird thing to be known by. Yeah, that asshole with the big forehead that breaks swords on the internet.
It's just a case of like you do the most thorough reviews. Like I can open something, I can give feedback on what it looks like, I can cut with it, and then, you know, it kind of ends up on the wall. But you're like, let's really break this sucker. So when Cloudhammer came around and everybody was like, "Oh my God, 51 CRV," and then you did the review, and I was like, that didn't hold up like what all the hype kind of seemed like it would. You know, that's a perspective we only get from you. Other people, they're like, "Oh, I got it. I cut pool noodles. It's amazing. I love it. Pass it on to the next person to review." You broke it to really see what it's going to actually do. And that's a limit that we don't find with most reviews.
Well, you know, in fairness, a lot of that started from, first it started from, I asked for a review sample because I wanted to do a destructive test. Many, many years ago, Ronin Katana was the first company that sent me a sword to review when I didn't have a YouTube channel. I didn't really do much, but it looked fun. I wanted the experience of pushing a sword to failure. I asked to do it. It worked out. I think I've talked about it on the interwebs a few times because there's context there about how it all happened. But anyway, they sent me a sword. I broke it. And then I gradually got better at it. But it's only a recent thing that I stopped breaking everything that was sent to me. And that's because I feel super weird about getting a thing for free and then having a thing of value at the end of the video. I still feel weird about it. I don't like it. But I don't have time to break everything. It's very time consuming to prepare not to die. And it also isn't useful all the time. Like, the Zisei katana is a great example of this thing that comes with a nice polish and it bent on a tatami mat. Like, if you value a sword that's going to bend cutting a tatami mat, if I take it to a steel pull, it's gonna break pretty quick.
Yeah.
But I think you can kind of predict that from it bending pretty easy on a tatami mat. And so breaking it would not be particularly useful. It's fragile. If you value the things that it has, it's not because it's durability. When I get a sword, though, that's like S7, that's like, hey, we make a sword that's exceptionally durable, I'm kind of compelled to validate that. And so it's not that I don't break things, but I've only recently moved away from breaking everything.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes there's the unintentional ones, like Samurai Bird was on the stream earlier. Him and I both got the Ryan sword Naginata. I had already ordered mine when he posted his video, and it had rolled on the bamboo. Mine ended up rolling on, I think it was like little thin bamboo, like a half inch or something in tatami. And because I'd seen his video, I was like, here's the blade, do one cut. Look, this thing rolled. Look, it rolled again, and was very meticulous about doing that. And he got a replacement from him, and I decided to just take store credit and get a Nodachi instead, because I was like, that's enough of this nonsense. But he said when he got his second one, he hadn't even started filming. He basically just picked it up to like play around with it, and the blade snapped off and almost hit him with it. So he did destructive testing before he even got on camera with it. And I was like, oh, I don't even know what to say about these things anymore. Like Ryan's sword does pretty good with swords by me, but the Naginata, they failed hard on destructive testing all around without even trying to.
That is a hard fail.
Yeah.
That is a real hard fail. Yeah. I'm not sure. There's no two ways to really swing that as like passably acceptable. I have had really good luck with the Ryan sword katanas, but that is a very depressing thing to be out there about the Naginata, which is unfortunate too, because like Naginata are really an underserved and very awesome weapon. And I study Naginata Jitsu. Like that's part of Katori is learning how to move in Naginata. And I don't have a good one. I do have 2 Naginata. Both of them suck. So okay. I would like to have a good one. I do not.
Do you have the Hanwei one? I've heard that one's pretty good, but it's like $700 or something too.
So I have one from Sabersmith, which has a short pull and the tang isn't long enough and it's round and the blade is dumb. In the sense that it's like, it'd be a fine, cool looking little fantasy pirate sword, but it's a shitty pole arm. I do have a Hanwei one. I have like a really, really early Hanwei one, and the Nakago is weird and messed up in comparison to the new one. The blade is the same size, which isn't terrible, and it's attached to a shaft that is too short, rounded, unlike the ovoid one that they come with now, and wildly warped from the previous person that owned it, like having it leaned against the wall, so the shaft like it runs all over the place. If I had to remount it, it might be okay, but I don't think it would ever be particularly good because the Nakago is still not long enough.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm wondering what the Nakago size is on the Ryan sword one, because I was thinking about trying to pop it out, give it to my friend, have it stropped and see if it'll straighten out, get it heat treated, and then build a half for it. But at the same time, I'm like, seems like a lot of work.
It seems like they're never long enough, because like the Nakago should be stupid long. Like it should be like 2 or 3 times the length of the blade. And very often they're kind of maybe the same size. The Hanwei one I think is the longest, and it's about the same size as the blade, but that's not sufficient in my mind. And it means that like a lot of tension is right where your hand tends to be if it's only the same size as the blade. Scott says Toyama Ryu doesn't really do kumitachi. They do it in my school, but I would say infrequently, though I think that has more to do with the me than the art. So you can't compare again Daibudo that focuses on killing innocent people execution style to Katori Shinto Ryu, a legit Koryu. That's fair. There are 2 different things. I would just say that from a random person that's like, I want to learn swords and I like Japanese swords, Toyama Ryu, Katori Shinto would be like, hey, 2 different things, and 2 people that sign up would have wildly different experiences in terms of what Japanese sword arts are and what the focuses are and all of that in terms of how to move a sword. And they both absolutely have pros. Are they equatable? I think so, in the sense that they're both, I mean, there's nuance, there's absolutely difference, but I think as like a consumer of those arts, I could conceivably have just done one and had a wildly different understanding of swordsmanship.
For sure, yeah.
Going through comments, we cut about once a year. Our students have cut before, usually do just fine. You trust in the training, teaches you how to cut without actually cutting. What sword art do you study? I'm sorry if I missed it. I'm gonna screw up this name. Teflon Drunk? Is that right? Hopefully. Teflon Drunk. What sword art do you study? But yeah, that's fair. I'd imagine, like, if I learned the reason, well, Toyama does these like big sweeping strikes. Katori does this, like, there's a movement called the Makiuchi, and it makes, like, I didn't wear armor for a really long time. I studied the art for like a few years before I put armor on and tried to move around doing it. And it makes a lot of sense when you wear armor. I can't explain it because it's against the rules, but effectively you coil a strike and uncoil it, and then your sword ends up in front of you rather than like past you, moved through the target. And then inherently that's going to mean that it, like, the blade will bury itself potentially in the target, but it's not going to go through because you're kind of keeping the center line. You're keeping your blade where it might still act defensively. And if you learn to cut that way, it's really tough to say if you're going to be able to execute that and like have it be effective at zipping through mats, gleefully. Not that it can't. I mean, but then you're just better than me. Kudos. I was a roommate with LGT with, I don't know what that is. I missed something that's going on. Funny story. First time cutting with a 1095 Hanban katana on a mat. I bent the blade so badly that it wasn't even cut at all. Went full force without knowing what I was doing.
Oh.
That's a story I'm sure a number of us have had. If you have a differentially hardened blade, then bad cuts will not be your friend, and you will bend your sword pretty well. You certainly can. If you have a through hardened blade, though, there's not, honestly, in my mind, a whole lot of sacrifice other than the visual aspect, and it'll probably survive that kind of stuff better. Clown Hammer S5, that's right. All right. Joe is here. Hello, Joe. All right.
Hello, Joe.
Shut up. Teflon Drunk studies Muso Shinden. Muso, is that the Musashi one? No, that's
I'm drawing a blank on the Musashi one. But
so I'm at a loss, but I've heard of it. I just don't know what the heck it is.
Niten Ichi Ryu is the two swords from heaven or something, is the Musashi one. Hey, Nate.
Nate is over here to say hi. All right. Well, so Samurai James, I think I've actually caught up with chat. I don't see any other questions, but then again, I'm terrible at chat, as anyone watching knows. Other armor stuff. If you don't mind, I will share a screen and we can chat through some of the cool stuff that I saw at the museum, because it's armor related and really cool. This thing, right? So off the top of your head, do you know what is unique and special about this thing?
I mean, the shape looks something like a Jingasa, which is a common Ashigaru type helmet that's a little bit pointed like that. I can't pick out anything in particular other than it seems to be extremely fancy and well detailed and riveted up. The ones I normally see are pounded out of a single sheet, so they don't have the different pieces and the riveting and everything. So nothing jumping out there.
I don't think I got a shot of the underside, but it spins on your head. That was the thing that made it special. It was on something that allowed it to turn. Wouldn't have guessed that either. I read that in the captions and then didn't get a photo of it because I wasn't thinking about it. It's very elaborately decorated. It looks really cool. There's an immense amount of decoration that runs all the way over it. Not necessarily as elaborate as some other ones, but it spins. It's like the rims of the day. You got a hat that spins on your head.
That's what I was going to say. 500 years later, somebody was like, let's do that to our wheels.
This one is obviously special because of this right here.
Swirly Mitsudome, yes.
That's what everyone likes.
That's the Abume stirrups.
This big old centipede right on your forehead.
Yep. That's the same helmet as one of the guys that was an absolute wall for me in the first Neo game. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but like in the game, they mixed like historical stuff with fantasy. So he's like this half yokai thing, which is like a demon or spirit or ghost. Yokai is kind of a vague-ish word in English, but he has like a whole centipede for half of his arm. And he like whips out at you and everything. That guy was awful. So
was it a human centipede? No, I'm kidding.
No, not quite that.
Wearing Yoroi, which is more convenient, wearing an Uchikatana or a Tachi?
Tachi, hands down. And there's actually I can't remember the name of it, but it's essentially an adapter that's a piece of leather with two sort of X's on it with some string that you can actually take an Uchikatana or a katana and wear it with the blade facing down like you would a Tachi by tying it around your waist.
I should check that out. One thing, incidentally, to note about armor, if you wear it, is that it scratches the shit out of your saya.
So, exactly why I like the Tachi.
It flows better and it doesn't chew it. Still, like, you'd maybe get some lumps, but you probably wouldn't, like, peel the fucking lacquer off the thing, which is a consequence of wearing it in the sash. So if you are wearing armor and then decide to put your katana in it, make sure that you don't value the scabbard or tie something around it to protect it, because it will scratch the shit out of the scabbard. Very deep down to the wood, kind of, not like superficial little dinky scratches, but like really gougy, deep, like key to your car, make you cry kind of scratches.
Yeah, when I did it, I had the Sarashi, and then I don't remember if I put the katana or wakizashi first, but that, and then another wrap, and then the other sword, and then another wrap, and tied it off. Even with a layer of fabric in between, it chewed up both sides on it.
Were tantos used only for seppuku and dinner parties?
No, they had a lot of martial applications. So once you get in close, you're trying to get to the cords of the helmet, get into the throat, get into the armpits. So similar to things with HEMA, when you get in close and the longsword becomes more of a, liability in some cases than a dagger or something that you can move freely, tanto is the same sort of thing. It's designed for close combat. They actually had some specific kinds called Yoroi Doshi, which is armor piercing. So there were tanto that were actually made specifically to try to get in between the plates of the scales, or if you're lucky and you get a soft scale or you hit a Nirigawa, then you can actually puncture through the armor with it.
I have a photo of one of those. Let me see if I can find it. But before I do, though, just zooming in on this thing here, you can see like the blacksmith's tongs as the helmet on. Incidentally, like this conch shell is a masterwork in terms of difficulty to make.
Yes.
So this is not like you might see tongs on there and be like, haha, lame, but like this is some premium. This is, the Bugatti Chiron kind of helmet of the day.
Yeah.
And the tanto that James is talking about. I know I owned one a while ago.
Yeah, the Yoridoshi had a much thicker mune back on the spine. I think it was straight or almost perfectly straight with like a mild curve to it, which is, great for puncturing and things like that. That looks like an Ikuchi style where the mouth and everything kind of flows together. But
yep. So this drop, what we would call in like North America, like a drop tip kind of edge, puts the tip in alignment. It's smaller and comes to a point, and it's called like an armor piercing dagger. If you can imagine using something like that, so you're wrestling now, your sword's lost, and you're trying to get in. Well, that little point is going to help you get under this thing up into the neck. It's going to find the gap in these armpits a little better. It can get, a little further into the eyes and the mouth, around the edge under the arms. Some of this might be exposed. You can get in there around the sash or obi. There's usually not metal. You can kind of get in there. So there's different areas where you kind of learn to stab, and then in the thigh area. So these cover the front of your legs, but the inner thigh and all of the goodness inside is exposed. So this kind of dagger is going to aid you in doing that.
Yeah, and that'll also do real well at getting through some of the mail, the Kusari there. You get enough pressure on it, that'll actually bust right through the links on it, especially the Japanese style, because they're only butted. And I do say only butted in comparison to the riveted stuff from the European, but the European tends to be free hanging, whereas the Japanese stuff, almost every ring is sewn down to the fabric. So it's better than butted stuff that just hangs on its own, like we got in the earlier European repro stuff. So it's kind of one of those middle pieces, but since they're just butted, when you get enough pressure, it just splits out like that. The European stuff that's riveted together, you basically have to break the ring to be able to get through.
If you can see these two examples kind of side by side. So this is a tanto from Rick. These are both modern mono steel pieces that are chungusier perhaps than their pieces from antiquity might be. But this is a Hirozakuri style tanto from Prismek, a Polish smith, and this is a Yoridoshi style tanto from Rick Barrett. And you can see that it has a very prominent kind of drop tip that brings it to a more acute point, and that's supposed to be effective in defeating armor. As a close quarters wrestling, I want to have the advantage and stab you now because I have a tanto kind of situation. Moving on from some armor here, and I'm going to probably go for another 15 minutes or so.
Okay.
So if you have questions, chat, please feel free and throw them out there. What about armor from horseback versus armor on foot?
So for that one, the early stuff for armor on horseback is Oyuroi or the Great Armor. It was very boxy. They generally didn't have haidate covering their thighs. They had, the tassets that would hang down here in front. They would have the body armor, the sode, and they would typically at that point have just one kote on their left arm that would help provide armor as they're shooting, and they would keep their right arm free. And some of the theory on this is that the reason that the samurai arms lace up on the inside like that in the later years is when they wanted to basically transition from archery to foot combat. And I'm not talking about transition over decades, but when samurai had to serve multiple purposes, like a knight was on horseback, that's what he did. He got his lance, he gets knocked off, he gets his spear, gets his poleaxe, but he's not out there trying to shoot a firearm. He's not trying to shoot a crossbow. They were very specific and focused. Whereas a samurai, if he wants to start engaging at range, you unlace the kote on the inside, let it dangle behind you. You start loosing your arrows, you lace up your sleeve, you draw, your sword, and it's stereotypical that they're like, every samurai fought with a katana. So maybe not draw your sword, but like you pick up your yari spear, you pick up your naginata, you head out into the field. But you started off with archery, so you're doing a lot more of a multi-purpose thing, which is why they didn't have gauntlets covering their fingers, with rare exceptions. There are some, but they had open fingertips because they were manipulating bows. They were manipulating firearms. They were a whole lot more of a multi-purpose thing for that. And when they transitioned from horseback to foot, on horse, the square boxy armor fit fine in the saddle and supported it like that. After the Mongol invasion, they realized, hey, we're going to have to start fighting on foot a lot more. Like, it's no longer just us fighting ourselves, and this ritualized combat is going to be going kind of by the wayside. And they realized fighting on foot didn't work so well in that type of armor. That's when they went to the Haramaki style do, the all precursors to the Tosei Gosoku. So they had kind of an in-between, which would be an armor more like this, where it has the shaping to a Tosei Gosoku, but has all the Odoshi lacing to it. And that's how the Oyuroi started off. They all had tons of lacing, which is why this is one of the evolutions before they went to very, very thin, sparse amounts of lacing, because this won't resist bullets. And to resist bullets, you need solid steel. And when you have solid steel, there's no point in lacing it. It's just extra maintenance. It's extra money to be building up and everything. So something like that one, they can wear on horseback. But you can see it's got the curved sode. It's not the larger O sode like this. And, when you were mentioning earlier with everything falling behind you, that's what these were meant to do. They were meant to fall behind you. So when you're doing your archery, you're fully protected back here. It's a small part of why samurai generally didn't have shields. Like, they do have shields. They were called teidate, but they weren't used the same way that we generally think of shields. That one is a laced armor. It's
You can see it's curved, like you mentioned before. It has
Yeah, more curvature down there and then straighter up at the top. I'm drawing a blank on that style of armor, but it's essentially there's a center section here for the body. The left side is a hinged plate in between, and then the back is a plate. And then on the right side, there can be two plates here, one that's basically half of each. And that was in between the Oyuroi and what would become the Tosei Gusoku. And that worked a lot better on foot because they had a lot more mobility. The armor just disperses the weight better by having it lifted up like that, like we talked about earlier, versus the square boxy type. And at some point, I do want to get an Oyuroi armor and just see what it's like to cut tatami in it and everything to really feel like, is what everybody says about this really as restrictive as it seems? Because people have said for many, many decades that knights were big and slow and lumbering and blah, blah, blah. But I can cut tatami in my medieval European armor, so some of that's clearly not right. And I really want to get in an Oyuroi and see if it's the same thing. Like if people really overstated this because they look at it or they see that it's heavy. Are they drawing conclusions that are based on their own thoughts and, expectations rather than real experience with it?
Incidentally, these displays, my photos, I don't think do the best job. I focused on some of the details, like some of this mother of pearl or abalone in the various arms and armor and stuff. But they have at this museum, they had stuffed horses, or at least very like looking analogies. And it's like they're life size. So it's extremely imposed. Like you get to stand and see what it would be like to see a samurai charging at your face. And like even in a museum, it's pretty scary. Like, you can kind of envision yourself as like the peasant in the path of an armored warrior charging at you. And, it must have been like a tank coming at you in the day.
For sure.
Yeah, like I really found the size of seeing these on horses at life size, up high up in like a charging pose. I imagine it was a pain in the ass to do that, but I found it to be very effective in kind of conveying the, kind of the intimidation factor that would come from these suits of armor and these warriors coming at you. Because like seeing them up there, you're like, huh, that's big and pretty scary.
Yeah, there's something to the samurai armor, like seeing it on display and seated. It's got such a formal or ceremonial sort of appearance to it, and the European stuff, up on the stand, like at least standing up, or in the early days, like at one point I had built my first armor stand and had it in the hallway just to mess with my girlfriend. So she opened the bedroom door and there was just this armor on the armor stand, and she let out one of the most horrendous screams I've ever heard. And it really, I was like, that was a lot worse than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be funny. And she was like halfway terrified.
Now your wife? Did it work? Or is
No. That long time ago. So not my wife.
That did not work out.
Yeah. One of the early days, early 20s when I'm like, this will be funny. Oh God, that wasn't funny. When you have really poor judgment.
Fair enough. I still do. I get it. Question from Handle 1111. Tried wearing Oyuroi? If yes, is it more convenient? If yes, which is more convenient, Oyuroi or Yuroi?
I have not tried it. It's one of the things that I want to eventually get my hands on one, and I do want to try it. I suspect that the regular Yuroi is at least more convenient if you're dressing yourself, but the Oyuroi has less pieces, so that's something that it may be more comfortable just by virtue of having less pieces to it. And that's one of the things that I'd really like to find out once I get in one.
Really interested in earlier forms of tachi, particular Kenukitana form. Have you tried one? I'm guessing that's like a ken. Is that the straight sword? Double looks like a jian kind of thing.
Yeah, that might be, because I know in the early days they had the straight bladed swords that they were still calling tachi. To me, tachi is always the classic curved sword. There's a lot of people that are selling, tachis, which are basically katana and tachi furniture. I do have a Ryan sword one that's about 5 inches longer than a regular tachi and has a much deeper sori to it. And I just got a SX105V Tachi from Cloudhammer, and I've filmed the unboxing and first impressions, but I haven't had time to soak tatami and cut with it yet. So I should be having that soon. So if you're not on the channel already, hit subscribe and keep an eye out for it. I'm hoping to get that up in the next few weeks.
Samurai James, incidentally, is linked in the description. If Googling Samurai James is too much, then it will be down there, and you can click in the description, which is probably harder. But go subscribe to Samurai James's channel. Damn it!
Thank you.
It's Samurai James post videos. Damn it! Stop having so many kids. Instead,
That's great. I mean, my wife's with the kids, so I got the time to come and do the stream. I get the time to film the unboxings, but then I got to edit it. Like, I'm a one-man show on it, so got to squeeze stuff in when I can.
What if you had unlimited time, what would you do with your YouTube channel? What would you change? Do different
with unlimited time?
Yeah.
I think I'd probably try to get out something once a week, and, you know, unlimited time doesn't mean unlimited money. So there's a little bit of that, but if I had a little bit of, you know, unlimited time and unlimited money, like I said, I would love to pick up an Oyuroi. I'd love to pick up a non-bond armor. I've been in 16th century European armor. I've been in 11th century mail. I've been in transitional stuff with Dakota plates. So I've got a variety of experience with that. I want to get some more experience with the samurai armor, not just to compare them to themselves, but to be able to compare across them as well, because the more time I get in each of those types of suits, the more I realize that there's a lot more similarities than there are differences from inside the suit. There's obviously all the visual differences and material differences, but, you know, all the time wearing them, it's really interesting to see how similar they can start to feel in some points.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. That would be a useful comparison. I have in my mind, as you are an armor specialist that dabbles in swords, and I'm a sword guy that dabbles in armor. I've been wanting to do something that talks about the various durability types of katanas as it relates to heat treatment, and I want to get. Hopefully, I can find a vendor that's willing to do it. I did ask one, but I haven't kind of spread the word yet. But I want to get a sword video together that gives me a through hardened blade and then a differentially hardened blade and a differentially hardened blade with a Hitatsura hamon, so that it's like the Japanese version of spring steel, and then a folded blade, and just be able to compare and contrast, like, what's the durability difference if I use the same steel from the same manufacturer and use through hardened mono steel, through hardened folded steel, differentially hardened mono steel, differentially hardened mono steel with a Hitatsura hamon, and then a folded steel, but ideally from like the same, you know, general types of steels with a differential heat treatment. And then I try to bash them all against things like which one lasts longer, what's useful. I think that something like that with armor, like what actually works would be a fun one.
Yeah, I mean, with unlimited budget, I'd like to be able to do kind of the similar sort of thing, you know, take armor and then hit it with swords, hit it with spears, hit it with, you know, kanabos and everything, but be able to say, here's what happened with, you know, partial Nirigawa for the leather scales. Here's what happened with heat treated stuff. Here's what happened with heat treated stuff that actually has urushi on top with the lacquer, and compare some of those things. Because I think Iron Mountain might be the only one that did a durability test with the samurai armor. I know Thane Thran did one a little while ago, but I think it was a lot shorter. I think it was like a 6-minute video instead of 25. And Iron Mountain Armory, they did like katana, they did spear, so they did more stuff with it. But at least there was 2 of them out there. But this thing is so beautiful. Like I can't fathom hitting it with swords or anything. So unless it was something I had unlimited budget to be like, cool, here's the one I wear, and I've got a spare to just tear up, like I'm never going to get to that point with it.
So the Romance of Men folks sent me an unpainted cuirass and helmet, right?
Oh.
And I did feature them a little bit in the video that I made. And I took a Romance of Men differentially hardened katana and I did a kabuto wari, and not really technically, because usually it's at waist height when you do it, but I struck, like I put it on a wooden pedestal, put the head on, wrapped some towels around a pole, stuck the helmet on, and then cut it, and the katana broke while I was hitting it. So it's not heat treated in the sense that like it's gonna spring back. It definitely like folds in, and you see consequence for being hit with the sword.
Yeah,
but the sword didn't cut through. Like it's not, you know. And by contrast, I've cut sheet metal and stuff like that. It's not made out of beer cans, basically.
And it's one of those interesting conundrums. Like soft steel, there's a greater chance of it cutting through, whereas hardened steel is, you know, more likely to resist. But when it fails, it's going to crack. So hardened steel will have a more catastrophic failure, whereas mild steel might dent and you might live through it. So it's a little bit of a toss up. And I really don't know if hardened or unhardened steel was more popular back in the samurai days or not.
I don't know either. And I don't know that there's as much. I don't know as much about it from an armor standpoint. Joe is asking James and Matthew, will an S7 blade cut through and survive armor, as it is Matt's steel of choice for the zombie apocalypse? You may have missed this, but one time on a live, somebody asked a question, I answered it, and I babbled on for like 25 minutes about how S7 was the steel type that has, at this point, or at the point that I had done reviewing when Joe was talking to me, the most durable steel that I had tested at the time. And so I talked about how that would be my choice for like 25 minutes. And then as soon as I was done talking, Joe was like, so what steel would you choose for the zombie apocalypse? And Scab was there as well and was like, are you serious, Joe? And it's been an inside joke ever since.
I mean, inside joke, I wouldn't be trying to cut it because, you know, the edge of a sword is meant to cut. If anything, I would be trying to thrust. And what that really comes down to is probably the quality of the armor. You know, there's stories of medieval European armor being punctured and split and things like that. Well, back then they were hammering everything out to, you know, take these iron billets. They didn't know about carbon composition. So you could have a breastplate that has a weak spot there. And if you get thrusted with a spear hard enough, it's going to go through the armor. It might not have somewhere else. And it would be the same thing with the S7 sword. Like the odds of the S7 sword not taking damage are pretty good, but getting through the armor is going to come down more to what is the quality of the armor than the quality of the sword.
Samurai James is a thruster, and that's why he has so many kids. On that note, I think we will call it here, Samurai James, and
sounds good,
and wrap things up. So thank you to everyone that has joined and kept the conversation lively. Thank you to Samurai James for joining me on this.
Thank you for having me.
If you're interested in checking out his channel, it's linked in the description below. Please go there and support Samurai James. Like and subscribe and share and all that stuff. So thank you to everyone. Cheers and have a good night.